Take two, camera.
I was sitting there quietly minding my own business and developing some other stuff, and Walter Parkes called me up and said, have you got 20 minutes? And threw a reproduction of this rather beautiful 19th century painting onto my desk, and I stared at it, and I went, oh God, because I knew I was essentially, you want to bleep this? I was fucked.
Once we got to a point where everyone knew what we were doing, they thought we were mad. You know, $100 million movie about a guy who kills innocent people and animals for a living.
You have to, in the end, understand who is it who gets their way. Because when you have disagreements, somebody has to give way.
Sophisticated feats of engineering, coupled with enormous set building, under the pressure of budget and schedule.
We weren't getting a lot of sleep because it was long, long hours.
Everyone had failed with Sword and Sandal for 40 years.
It was a risk for everybody. Would an audience come back?
When I was a kid, I did a year of graduate school, got sick of the university, as we all do. Bummed around Europe, East Bloc, West Bloc, saw a lot of coliseums. When I got to Baghdad, I swapped a book on the Irish Revolution for a book by a guy named Daniel P. Mannix called Those About to Die, which is a very tawdry sort of overview of the Colosseum and the games. But the thing that was great about Mannix's book was that it identified the ancient games with sort of modern entertainment games. And I never forgot about it. I always thought, gee, I'd make a great movie someday. And by the time I got to India, I think I decided I wanted to be a screenwriter. So, years later, when I was writing Amistad in Rome, I began researching Gladiator and working on the script.
I had worked with David Franzoni on one other project, and he came to me with some research about the Roman arena. And as you looked at the research, or as I looked at the research, you realize it was completely the epicenter of the whole society. And in the way that in that period of time all roads led to Rome, all roads in Rome led to the arena. And it was the center of technology. They were literally eradicating species of animals on the world because they were taking so many to destroy in their arena in more and more theatrical ways. But as we read the research, it felt very contemporary. There are a lot of ideas of a whole population distracted by entertainment while they were missing the more serious issues that felt very much like now.
I think the behavior of people is odd because it doesn't really change, does it? I think the weapons change, the clothing changes, but fundamentally people's behavior doesn't change. Politics are all essentially the same. I would even say you get equally the same amount of backstabbing today as you did then. Now it's a bit more metaphorical.
If we went to a Roman amphitheatre to watch the games, it would seem enormously familiar in some ways. You know, the way you get your ticket and you're shown to your proper seat, and the vendors come around and you buy refreshments, and it might seem perfectly ordinary. And then you realise that the spectacle is different.
Just like in a modern either soccer or American football stadium where they love to see people hit and get hurt, and the ranting of 50, 60, 70,000 people.
And we have the WWF, and we have all of the different sort of wrestling things, and we have professional boxing is still the biggest thing on TV when there's a heavyweight fight.
It's a question that we've all been asking and debating about is, what is the desire for blood sport and people, what is that? Is it an escape?
I think what pulls us to Gladiators is the adrenaline. There is a real excitement. Sport is exciting. Blood sport is that much more exciting. And I think there's a sort of morbid fascination the present has with the Roman past, because we ask all the time, could we be like these guys? Could we sit around 50,000 people in a great building watching someone die, cheering? Could we be like it? Or are they completely different from us? Are they monsters? Did they work differently as human beings? And I think we know that there's a bit in us that is absolutely there with the Romans. We could be like them.
When you think about the amphitheatre, whether you're watching two people fighting or a person and an animal, there's an element of unpredictability there, which is balanced out by the comparative skill of the two participants. And that kind of sort of gambling on the odds, I think, was a great attraction in those days and must also still be an attraction now. Although I think the major attraction today of looking at the Roman amphitheatre is through the telescope of time, looking at this sort of frozen cultural phenomenon, which seems so alien and yet in some ways fulfills many of the instincts that we have been taught not to indulge.
What was most important about it, and I think was least interesting to me, were the way they'd done Roman epics in the past was trying to capture, I think they were trying to capture what it must have been like to be an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek. And I don't think that's possible, first of all. And secondly, I don't find it very interesting.
We know that sword and sandal movies had been failing for about 40 years when we started work on Gladiator. And I think my best analysis was that they just felt locked in the past.
What I was trying to find a way in with Colosseum for us on Gladiator was, how is this about us? You know, how is this about the United States? And when I first talked to Steven Spielberg about it, I told Steven, I said, you know, in a way, this really isn't about ancient Rome at all. This is about Los Angeles 1,000 years from now. Coliseum is Dodger Stadium. I modeled Proximo very consciously after a CIA agent. I mean, I used to say Mike Ovitz, but it could have been any CIA agent. And we have, you know, I guess a modern morality play. So I had it all kind of worked out. I went in to see Steven, and Steven had heard that I was going to come in and pitch a Gladiator piece. So the meeting was basically, it was Steven and Walter Parks, and Steven goes, so David, I understand you want to do a movie about a gladiator. And I go, yeah. In ancient Rome, yeah. In the Colosseum, in ancient Rome, yes. Okay. And that was it. So I remember Walter called me that afternoon and goes, you know, David, do you have a story worked out? And I said, you know, I've got it all worked out, Walter, so don't fear. But Steven knew it was time.
It was just one of those pitches that, on a conceptual level, made sense immediately. I mean, a lot of people have talked about, gee, you know, why did you all get behind a movie the likes of which hadn't been made for such a long time? But I don't know why. The timing for this movie just seemed right when we heard it the first time. And as I said, the emotional contour, just again, in the very most rudimentary form, the emotional contours were there of this basic hero's journey.
After we had solved the script, and we had a real character journey set in the Roman arena, the question of filmmaker was really daunting.
We were looking for someone with vision, of course. You know, and there were sort of two balls to keep up in the air on this. One was we were doing a serious, dramatic piece, and performances were crucial. The other was we were making this fantastic spectacle. We were doing sort of a theme park, if you will. And so we needed a director who had those capabilities.
You know, we talked about the short list of people that can do that kind of work. And on the short list, of course, is Ridley Scott. There's maybe no one who's ever been better at creating a coherent other world. You know, you think of what he did in Blade Runner.
There's a tiny, tiny handful of directors who can create worlds, who can deal with enormous technical problems, and here's the important point, but not be overwhelmed by them. Not literally forsake the really important issues of narrative and story and theme because the pursuit of the size is crushing. When you really look at that list, you go right to Ridley.
Unlike many people, Ridley's an artist. He often jokes about spending his twilight years in some garden painting. And so Walter Parks and I went to see Ridley, and we brought the script, and we also brought a painting, a famous painting of the arena.
The artist was Jean-Léon Gérôme, and it was entitled Thumbs Down. And it shows a corner of the Colosseum, the wall, and one seems to be looking back up at what probably is one of the more corrupt of the emperors. It looks like Nero, I think, who's actually leaning over in a kind of rather debauched state with his thumb down, indicating that the Antibatai who is the armored gladiator, who's standing over the vanquished who is still alive, and he's looking up at the emperor saying, should I kill him or not? And the guy's doing that, which means death.
I remember showing him the picture and then launched into the pitch. Doug and I told him about how we're going to change the script and what our ideas are. And I remember talking to him, and he'd be looking at me very interested, and his eyes would glaze slightly, and his eyes kept on going to the picture. He'd come back to me very politely, kept on going to the picture. And I think halfway through, without really hearing the pitch at all, he picked up the print and said, yeah, I can do this.
I just loved the whole, view. That segment was what really turned me on to it. Saying, we can do that. And we haven't seen that. And certainly not with the technology we can employ today, where we don't have to build the whole arena. We can build a segment of the arena, we can expand on that, we can do all kinds of things, and, really do an epic in the grand sense of the word.
When you go to the ruins of Rome now, you get really no sense of the scale and the grandeur of what that forum would have been. It's hard to get it anywhere except from some of the great epic films of the past, like Ben-Hur and Quo Vadis and The Fall of the Roman Empire, who did elaborate reconstructions.
When I was a kid, there was this TV series that was made in England called I, Claudius. And I saw that, and I was, fascinated.
I think he knows what Rome is.
When I saw that Derek Jacobi was going to be in our movie, I was so thrilled, because I remembered what a genius job he did on I, Claudius.
My favorite moment in any previous epic was the chariot race in Ben-Hur. I can't think of anything that was more cinematic, more exciting, and also full of character.
In both chariot races in Ben-Hur, the 1929 Ben-Hur, I think it's 1929, is amazing chariot race, absolutely amazing. And then later Charlton Heston's. There were some very good things about that. They got the scale right.
We stood in the shadow of all the other epic Roman films ever done. A lot of these stood as examples of what not to do. The trend toward the end in the 50s and 60s was a theatricality of a style of language which had more to do with, I think, classical Shakespearean theater.
Doing these things, you're always trying to find the level of dialogue that flies so it doesn't become a deeply period piece where you lose 9/10 of the audience immediately.
How can I reward Rome's greatest general?
Let me go home.
I did my basic research for Gladiators, spent a lot of time hanging out in the Coliseum. But it gets to a point where you sort of hit saturation, where you go, okay, I'm not smart enough to get this right anymore. And by this time, meanwhile, I'm writing the script for DreamWorks at this point, and we brought in Kathleen Coleman, who now teaches at Harvard, teaches a class in the Roman games, if you can believe that. She came in, obviously, and started going, no, David, that's not right, or yes, David, that could work, or who the hell knows, in which case I'd use it, of course.
The written sources don't ever discuss amphitheater spectacles in detail. They're all incidentally mentioned in the larger context of some other issue.
Remember, history is only written down by people, and that's their report on what they think at the time or what other historians have written at the time.
It's difficult to recover the view of Mr. Average Roman going to the amphitheater except by indirect means. The fact that the Roman Empire is absolutely littered with amphitheaters and other structures in which gladiatorial spectacles took place is one pointer to the fact that there must have been a huge attraction about these spectacles.
This is a Roman-designed building, basically using the idea of a theater, but putting two of them face to face. And it was for a specific form of Roman entertainment, which was combat between two fighters, possibly to the death. This has its origin in funeral games, the idea being to make a human sacrifice to the gods of the underworld on the occasion of a funeral, so that we know the first of these human sacrifice gladiatorial games took place during a funeral here in Rome in around 250 BC.
What I would say about research is, if you can use it well, reality gives you stuff you could never invent. And it's a fantastic resource. But you have to use it well. You are writing a story. You're not writing history. And your story, I think, has got to come first.
What you can really do is actually pinpoint the dates, which are probably accurate, pinpoint the times, pinpoint the characters, then do a bit of research about each of those characters, and then try and deduce who they were.
There was a Roman general who sort of matched this historically, who when Commodus became emperor disappeared because he was a great general and knew that he was on the hit list. No one ever knows what became of him. So I took a little bit of that, what we did know of him, and put it into Maximus's character.
The thing that most helped us was building the whole movie around a character. Because right away, you let go of the burden of we're somehow trying to recreate ancient Rome in a very specific period of time, and instead saying we're telling you a story of character. We're telling you about a man trying to find his way home. We're telling you a story about someone finding inner strength in a tough time. And right away, that's a kind of mythic story that is relevant to everybody in the audience, struggling with their own day, with their own ethics, with their own principles.
Around that, I think was one of the most interesting characters of the movie was Commodus, who was this dysfunctional, I think extremely sympathetic young emperor who people mostly just perceive as the bad guy, so a lot of it went straight over their heads. I think one of the best scenes of the film is where Commodus is told by his father that he's not going to be the emperor.
Are you ready to do your duty for Rome?
David Franzoni, the first writer, completely had the dream. And from bits of research, again talking about people who are at the top of that society at the whim of an emperor, suddenly being a slave to fight for their life in the arena seemed incredibly fascinating. So that was all in the Franzoni control of the script.
David had brought the overall grand plan, and I think we needed the characterizations to be a little less on the nose, and the dialogue was tricky and very hard, I think, to pull off, and therefore we moved towards somebody that I'd already worked with.
Did my last draft, and then Ridley brought John Logan on, and they just worked together on a piece.
John is a very good classical playwright, and I think I needed all this information converting into a good 3-act play, drama.
John created a lot of beautiful scenes between characters, did some fantastic work in all of those wonderful scenes in the opening, in the first act.
John Logan is a playwright, and his interest tends to be in human relationships. And, you know, I remember when I first read John's draft, and there's a moment between Richard Harris and Connie Nielsen. He says, let's not speak politics, you know, let's pretend that I'm a good father and you're a loving daughter. They walk for a few minutes and they say, this is a pleasant fiction.
Isn't it?
And I found that so sophisticated. It seemed like such a, you know, wonderfully insightful, simple, yet, you know, in terms of amount of words, but complex in terms of an understanding of this relationship. So I suddenly realized, well, wait, maybe this movie could be more than just a vehicle for great action sequences and a big, brawny, heroic adventure, but maybe we can really delve into, like, the complexity of character.
I'm pretty sure most of the dialogue that survives, most of the best dialogue that survives is John Logan's.
Rome is the light.
The scenes were the same scenes, but John, you know, had spent a lot of time working on the dialogue.
Between David and John, the script really started to shape up.
Now, I had kept the family alive, his son and his wife alive, and they wanted to kill him. And I said, look, I'll tell you, right now, I mean, my only hesitation is that this isn't a revenge film. This is a movie about going home. So in Gladiator, theoretically, it isn't necessary to kill Commodus. Of course, it's, you know, feel good if you kill Commodus. But what is necessary is that he gets home. So if you kill a family, it makes it difficult. So I kept saying, you know, I'm not sure that's the right thing.
We were always wanting him to like head toward his relationship with Lucilla and Connie as not exactly a love affair, but kind of the emotional target in the here and now. And as long as it had to do with, but trying to double back to this other family, it just never had this kind of mythic clarity that these sorts of movies really want, you know? And it was a very liberating thing to decide, what if they were killed?
And, everybody, got a head of steam on it because it was a little awkward keeping the family alive. So, the easiest thing to do is kill them. So they killed them.
It freed up our storyline toward this kind of emotional connection with Connie, but it also sealed the deal motivationally for Maximus. The human loss that he experiences and how that motivates him, at least through the better part of the second act, gave the movie a drive that we didn't have before. Again, so these are the kinds of conversations you have in the room, and from these conversations about theme come suggestions, plots, pitches, character beats, and it just somehow in front of you, a movie takes shape.
Then they began changing the script a lot. They began taking out the sort of, issue that Maximus could go into the Colosseum and survive.
Part of the problem was that since Maximus was such a great warrior, any version of the emperor fighting him one-on-one in the arena made the emperor an imbecile. And so we kept struggling, and then in these ongoing story meetings, someone had the really smart idea of the emperor would stab Maximus, nearly killing him, suit him up, and then, of course, under those circumstances, the emperor, being cagey, could go in, finish him off in front of the crowd, and win the love of the crowd.
We have burnout because we're approaching the production, and I'm building. So Walter, in his courage, had said, "Let's go. Let's greenlight the movie." I said, "I'll come in. I'll do this, but you have to greenlight." He said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Fine." So he greenlit before we'd had a script down, which I thought was pretty brave.
Actually, we committed to do this movie with very little evidence that we could do the movie, but there was very much a shared sense, an idea, an image in everyone's head of what this movie could be.
It's interesting because now you're under full pressure. You've got to get it right. So there's no choices. I mean, we sat around the table days and days and days. Literally, if you're coming in, so barrier against the wall in the story, and the writer was there being grilled, and everybody's putting their brains together because everybody wants to make it right.
In these intense script meetings, Laurie MacDonald was the only female.
There had been a series of meetings that she was not able to go to because of responsibilities she had with our kids. And during those meetings, we came up with a wonderful idea for the third act, which was that about 20 pages before the end, Maximus would come back and find Lucilla has committed suicide. We thought that would really motivate him to bring down Rome. And of course, Laurie came back and was aghast. Just literally, there's one female connection to this entire movie, and you've just killed her. Good work, guys.
Probably the most bitter adjustment in the script for Ridley was Ridley kept talking about this fantastic fight between Maximus and a rhino.
Well, I always wanted to do a rhinoceros, and I wanted a rhino in North Africa. I wanted to show something absolutely monumentally crazy rather than just more guys.
He storyboarded the fight. We all know what a ferocious animal a rhino is. And of course, you always go from, well, wouldn't it be cool if, and then you get the reality. We started to see videotape of trained rhinos around the world. And a rhino moves very slowly unless you get it so angry, and then it's unstoppable. And there's no in-between.
The whole rhino thing would have cost us $3 million. Because I'd have to build an animatronic, because animatronics are only part of the solution. I could build a perfect rhino head, full size, from me to you, on a ram, which will look absolutely real, will snap and gouge and ram its head through a wall. And you can probably build one that actually moves, but it's going to be limited. So you're going to need also a couple of good rhinos in there that'll function, real rhinos. But the big trick really is to do it CGI.
Needless to say, a CG rhino is incredibly expensive. I think the price tag then was about $1 million. So we were always struggling with budget, as all big movies do. And one day, the rhino dropped out of the story.
We got to the point where we were having a read-through in London. And since I was a producer, even though I was no longer the writer, they couldn't get rid of me. So I had nothing to lose by saying it was on my mind. So I said, we're having the read-through tomorrow. I said, but the script still doesn't work.
It was a collaboration that was not about compromise. There was no like, oh, okay, you think this, I think that, maybe we'll settle on that. No, people had extremely passionate points of view.
We just couldn't get it all to come together. So I sent the script to Bill Nicholson just as we were starting to do a reading with all the actors at Shepperton in London. And at that reading, everyone was aware that something wasn't quite right.
I was working with the producer, Doug Wick, on a quite separate project. And I got a phone call and he said, I have this project Gladiator and we have a problem. And the problem was that they just had a read-through. This was 2 weeks before the start of principal photography. They'd had a read-through with the cast and it had not gone well.
Bill Nicholson faxed me a 4-page memo that was a pretty brilliant analysis of what was missing.
I wrote a couple of pages back to him saying what I thought needed to happen to the script. And he sent those to Walter Parkes, who was the boss at DreamWorks, who was very, very much involved with Gladiator all the way through. Very important guy on Gladiator. Walter read the notes and he said, get this guy on board, pay him whatever it takes. So Doug came back to me and said, would you be prepared to do a little work on this, maybe a couple of weeks' work, and it's a production rewrite. Now that's how it began. I was on it to the end. I was on it for the next 15 weeks.
So we brought Bill in, and he kind of went the final distance and really pulled that third act together and sort of Maximus' death to joining his family in the next life.
The script that I read was like a revenge movie. It was quite dark. The main character became very nihilistic. There was quite a lot of confusion in the plotting in the second half. And I know that Ridley and Doug and Walter wanted the plot sorted out, and they wanted the characters made more likable. I mean, that's not to say that they weren't likable, but they wanted more. And that's what I wanted. I mean, I'm not an action writer. You don't hire me to write fight sequences. The fight sequences were there. They were storyboarded. They were even starting to shoot them. My job was character and structure. The key thing I identified was, this is a story of a man who wants to kill somebody. And I personally don't want to go and see a movie about somebody who wants to kill somebody. I want to go and see a movie about somebody who loves somebody. And so I thought to myself, who does he love? Given that he's going to die at the end of the movie, that was the structure I inherited. Who does he love? He loves his wife and child. How can I create a plot for this story that means that his drive is to be with the people he loves rather than to slaughter a monster? The slaughtering of the monster is good, I'm not against that, it's just not the end of the story for me. Not unless you're making, I think, a lower grade movie. So, the obvious answer was an afterlife.
I do think the seeds of this connection to Elysium were there. It was almost like too close for any of us to actually see. And which is why, sometimes it takes that fresh set of eyes. It took Bill, having nothing to do with this, reading the script with no background whatsoever, to say, well, this is very interesting, but my Lord, this is rather depressing. He dies at the end. How can we possibly come up with something so that, you feel that in his death he's achieved something?
We thread this through the movie so that his actual aim is to rejoin his beloved wife and child in the next life, and in that way, the act of dying becomes an act of winning, an act of triumph.
And almost like an archaeologist, an emotional archaeologist, he found the beginnings of all this in John's draft, this kind of sense of connection to the afterworld. But what was so brilliant was to decide to fully portray it, not just in dialogue, but actually visually. And of course, what that gave us, as rendered by Ridley, was a a hero's death at the end, which was, you know, as satisfying as a happy ending.
They got to the point where they realized they had to have the family at the end of the film. Because the movie is, again, not a revenge film, it's about a man trying to get home. And if Maximus can't get home, the movie fails. So Ridley said, well, and on German front, he said, I'll do a long-distance phone call. So when Maximus is praying, you see the family. And it worked beautifully. And then they came up with the idea of the afterlife. And I thought at the time, if anybody can do it, Ridley can do it. And if he does, it's better than my original ending, because it'll be perfect or it'll stink. And of course, Ridley turned in an absolutely magnificent vision of a pagan afterlife, of Maximus returning home.
I then started to thread that right the way through from the beginning to create a character who, instead of being a soldier who becomes a killing machine, is somebody who doesn't want to be a soldier.
A1, take 5.
The first thing you ever see, I said, we've got, before the battle even starts, we've got to have a sense that this man doesn't want to be here. If you remember the business with the bird. There's lots of ways I wrote in, even before the battle, when he's riding along, in the beginning of the battle, he says to his men, if you find you're in green fields, don't worry, you're dead. You're in Elysium. And by planting this all the way through, and I rebuilt all of the scenes with Juba so that we could play this theme all the way through, you realize this is a man who's pursuing the ultimate, really, which is transcending death and finding love after death, which completely transforms your reaction to the man. And it makes you love him, because he's not now killing because he's so big and tough, he's killing because he has to. My own belief, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is that because of all those changes I made to his character, he became appealing to women. He was always going to be appealing to men. He was always a great fighter. But there are so many movies of great, tough fighters that are only watched by 16-year-old boys. You know, Gladiator isn't like that. Gladiator has, I think, something like 50% of its audience is women. What they saw on screen was their dream man, a man who's very, very strong, but very, very loving.
Between the three writers who then would circulate. So John had burnout, Bill came in, he had burnout, went back to John, and we came back to Bill again. Franzoni is a producer on this, so he's actually just keeping an eye on how things go, because he knows in that area they're better at what they bring to bear than he is, so I think he was very cool about it.
It's not a case of me solving problems and me doing it all, or the other writers. It's this group focus that says we're getting closer all the time to understanding who our characters are and what they want to do. How can we make this absolutely perfect, so nothing's going wrong, so everything follows on from everything else? And I couldn't tell you, looking through it, what's me and what's Doug and what's Walter and what's Ridley and what's John Logan and what's David Franzoni, what's Russell Crowe, because he's making suggestions as well. That's how films get made.
I think it was fairly handled, actually. You know, at the end of the day, you've got one thing in mind: how do I make this film the best we can possibly make it?